Loneliness is a quiet hum until you realize the sound isn't coming from your own head. Elias lived in a complex where the walls were thin enough to hear a neighbor's breath, yet thick enough to bury their secrets. It started with the scratching, a rhythmic, desperate sound coming from behind the baseboards of apartment for C. He thought it was rats at first, something small and mindless trapped in the insulation of the old building. But rats don't tap in Morse code, and rats don't whisper your name through the electrical outlets at 3 a.m. The voice was thin, like paper tearing, vibrating through the copper wires and directly into his inner ear. He stopped sleeping, watching the shadows under his door stretch and shrink like they were lungs gasping for air. The building manager ignored the complaints, his eyes glazed over as if he were a mannequin in a suit. Everyone in the complex moved with a heavy, mechanical gait, their faces drained of any recognizable humanity. Then the smell arrived, a cloying, metallic sweetness that settled in the back of his throat like a weight. It was the scent of something that had been forgotten in the heat, something that used to have a pulse. Elias followed the stench down to the basement, the air growing thick and cold as he descended the stairs. The light at the bottom was a sickly green, pulsing like a dying star against the damp, weeping concrete. In the corner, a pile of clothes sat soaked in a dark, viscous liquid that refused to reflect the light. He realized then that the scratching wasn't coming from the walls, but from the marrow inside his neighbor's bones. The building wasn't housing tenants. It was a digestive tract, and the rent was paid in human life. Elias turned to run, but the door was no longer there, only a wall of smooth, unbroken, pulsing brick. The brick didn't feel like stone. It felt like a living membrane, warm and slightly damp under his touch. Behind him, the pile of soaked clothes began to shift, the fabric tearing as a skeletal figure stood up. It was the girl from 3B, the one who always wore oversized headphones to drown out the city's noise. Now, those same headphones were fused into her skull, the plastic melting into her gray, translucent skin. A wet, clicking sound erupted from her throat, a language made of broken teeth and stagnant air. Elias backed away, his heels splashing into a puddle that felt far deeper than the concrete floor allowed. "The building is hungry, Elias," she whispered, her voice coming from the ceiling pipes instead of her mouth. The walls began to pulse in time with his heart, a slow, deep throb that shook the foundations. He realized every light in the hallway was an eye, and every vent was a mouth waiting to feed. He found a service hatch, a small, rusted square of metal that promised a way into the dark vents. As he crawled inside, the smell of copper and old rot became an absolute, suffocating weight on his chest. The vent was lined with human hair, long and black, tangling around his wrists and pulling him backward. He kicked wildly, his shoe connecting with something soft and wet that let out a low, familiar moan. There was no exit, only deeper layers of the hive, where the voices became a deafening, unified scream. Elias stopped fighting when he felt the first needle-like tooth sink into his shoulder, tasting his fear. His vision faded into a sea of red and black, the sound of the building's heart drowning out his own. Then silence, a heavy, artificial silence that felt like a hand pressed over his mouth and nose. Elias woke up in his own bed, the morning sun cutting through the window grime like a rusted blade. The nightmare felt like a fever dream, a lingering side effect of the stale, stagnant apartment air. He went to the bathroom to splash water on his face, but his reflection didn't move when he did. His reflection's eyes were hollowed out, replaced by the same flickering green light from the basement. He tried to scream, but only black, oily hair spilled out of his mouth and into the sink. The mirror began to crack, the glass webbing outward from the reflection's forehead like a slow-motion bullet. A hand emerged from the mirror, a pale, skeletal claw that gripped the edge of the sink with a metallic screech. Elias watched as his own reflection stepped out of the glass, a hollow version of himself with no soul. The creature reached out and touched Elias's chest, its fingers cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. "The rent is paid," the creature said, its voice a perfect, terrifying mimicry of Elias's own. Elias felt himself being pulled toward the mirror, his body turning into a fine, gray mist as he dissolved. He was now the reflection, trapped in the cold, damp basement, while the monster took his life. The creature adjusted its navy hoodie, checked the mirror one last time, and walked out into the world. Outside, the police sirens were wailing, but they weren't there for Elias. They were part of the building. The building began to groan, the sound of thousands of people screaming in a frequency humans can't hear. Elias sat in the dark basement of the mirror, watching the next tenant move in through the glass. He tried to warn her, but his voice was just the scratching she would hear behind her baseboards. This is Midnight Country, where the darkest stories are told after midnight. Subscribe, stay alert, and never trust the silence.